An elderly woman boards a flight, quietly settling into her seat. But when a young flight attendant refuses to serve her, she has no idea who she's dealing with. Prepare yourself for a riveting cascade of events, an unfolding drama filled with unexpected revelations, subtle power plays, and a twist of fate that will challenge everything you thought you knew about respect and authority in the skies. Every moment is charged with tension and mystery, hinting at a secret strength hidden behind a gentle demeanor. A strength that has the potential to upend the entire airline's destiny. Before we start the story, comment below and let us know where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. On a sunny afternoon, Flight 347 was scheduled to take off from Atlanta's busy Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. The passengers had already filed in, the crew completed their final safety checks, and every seat was filled in anticipation of the journey to New York. Among them was a composed, elderly woman known as Mrs. Eleanor Westwood, whose serene presence went almost unnoticed by most. Dressed modestly, with her silver hair neatly tied back and a small bag resting by her side, she exuded a quiet dignity that, to many, resembled that of a typical traveler heading off to visit family. Yet to the vigilant eyes of the flight crew, she was simply another passenger, not someone of particular note. At least, not yet. As the aircraft climbed smoothly to cruising altitude, the cabin buzzed with the routine activity of flight attendants attending to the needs of the travelers. They strolled down the aisles, offering refreshments and ensuring everyone was comfortable. It was during one of these rounds that a young attendant, Olivia Taylor, noticed Mrs. Westwood seated near the rear. With her window shade drawn up and her gaze lost in the drifting clouds, the elderly woman seemed detached from the minor discomforts of the flight. Except that her seat, stubbornly non-reclining, offered little respite, and the child in the adjacent row was persistently jostling her space. Concerned by this disruption, Olivia Taylor circled back. With a brisk tap on Mrs. Westwood's shoulder, she addressed her in a tone that, while courteous, carried an unexpected edge. "Excuse me, ma'am," Olivia Taylor said. "Would you mind switching seats? That child is causing a disruption, and we need to keep things orderly." Mrs. Westwood slowly lifted her gaze, momentarily startled by the abrupt request. Having flown countless times over the years, she was no stranger to minor inconveniences and knew well the art of making do. However, something about Olivia Taylor's tone rubbed her the wrong way. "I'm fine here, thank you," Mrs. Westbrook responded softly, her voice calm and steady. But Olivia Taylor didn't like the answer. Instead of letting it pass, Olivia stood with her arms crossed, her eyes narrowing as she fixed her gaze on Mrs. Westwood. "I'm not sure you understand, ma'am," she said, her tone growing impatient. "We need to keep the peace, and if you're uncomfortable, it would be easier for everyone if you just moved." She shot a quick, irritated glance at the child in the adjacent row before returning her stern look to the elderly woman. "I can't have passengers causing a fuss." Her presence exuded undeniable, enigmatic strength, quietly commanding unwavering respect. For a long moment, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. Mrs. Westwood, maintaining an air of quiet dignity, simply offered a gentle nod. Even though a subtle tremor of anxiety flickered in her eyes, she remained composed, her measured reply lingering in the charged silence. "I appreciate your concern, young lady, but I've been on planes for many years and I know how to handle a little discomfort." Olivia, however, remained unconvinced. Bound by her duty to enforce order and fixated on the disruption, she turned away without another word. Yet, as she walked, she couldn't help but cast a final, dismissive glance back at Mrs. Westwood, muttering under her breath, "Some people think they can do whatever they want." For the rest of the flight, an undercurrent of tension wove through the cabin. Whispers began among the passengers, some uneasy with Olivia's brusque manner, others shrugging it off as a simple misunderstanding. Amidst the quiet murmur, one thing became unmistakably clear. There was far more to Mrs. Westwood than met the eye. No one could have guessed just how much more. Olivia Taylor, however, had no idea that this was far from the end of the story. What she didn't realize was that Mrs. Westwood was not merely another elderly passenger. There was an unspoken power in her calm demeanor that hinted at a life far more extraordinary than anyone could guess. In the minutes that followed, as Olivia resumed her routine of delivering drinks and checking in on the passengers, that brief, tense encounter with Mrs. Westwood lingered stubbornly in her thoughts. Despite her efforts to focus on her duties, an unsettling feeling crept into the back of her mind, as if the quiet woman held secrets that could upend everything. As Olivia made her way down the narrow aisle for another round of service, she caught sight of Mrs. Westwood again. This time, the elderly woman was seated by the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap, and her eyes fixed on the ever-changing patterns of clouds drifting beneath the plane. There was something mesmerizing in the way she remained utterly composed amid the chaos of travel. Stopping in her tracks, Olivia paused with a neutral expression that barely concealed the lingering tension from their earlier encounter. "Are you sure you're all right, ma'am?" she asked, her voice soft, yet carrying an undercurrent of concern. Mrs. Westwood turned her head slowly, offering a small, almost imperceptible smile that seemed to calm the air around her. "I'm perfectly fine, thank you," she replied in a steady, reassuring tone that only deepened Olivia's curiosity. For a long moment, the space between them seemed to vibrate with unspoken meaning, an almost palpable mix of calm resolve and hidden strength. Just as Olivia was about to move on and resume her tasks, Mrs. Westwood's voice cut through the quiet, gentle yet firm. "I would like to speak to the captain when you have a moment." Olivia blinked, taken aback by the unusual request. It wasn't every day that a passenger, especially one who appeared so unassuming, asked to speak directly with the captain over what seemed like a minor seating issue. With a puzzled look, Olivia glanced down the aisle toward the cockpit, and then back at Mrs. Westwood. Are you sure, ma'am? I'm sure we can resolve whatever issue you have here." Olivia Taylor tried to steer the conversation back, but Mrs. Westwood's expression remained unwavering. "I'd prefer to speak to the captain," Mrs. Westwood repeated, more resolutely this time. Olivia Taylor hesitated for a moment. She had been taught to handle customer service issues without involving the captain unless it was absolutely necessary. Still, something about Mrs. Westwood's calm insistence made Olivia Taylor reconsider. She could tell that Mrs. Westwood wasn't going to let this go. "All right, I'll see what I can do," Olivia Taylor said, more to get the woman off her back than anything else. But she didn't expect what was about to happen next. Olivia Taylor made her way to the front of the plane and spoke to the captain, explaining that a passenger had requested a word with him. The captain, a tall man named Captain James Thornton, gave her a confused look, but agreed to check it out. "Is everything all right back there?" he asked, clearly unaware of any issue. Olivia Taylor gave him a quick, vague answer, trying to avoid making the situation seem like a bigger deal than it really was. "It's just a small thing," she said. "I'm sure it won't take long." Captain James Thornton, though curious, simply nodded and started walking toward the back of the plane. As he made his way down the aisle, Olivia Taylor felt a sense of unease. There was a small crowd of passengers now, watching, their eyes flicking between her and the captain. Some of them had caught the earlier tension, and others were just trying to figure out what was going on. Meanwhile, Mrs. Westwood remained seated, calm and composed, as though she had all the time in the world. It seemed like the whole situation had become more than just a seat disagreement. Olivia Taylor couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something important. But what could it be? After all, she was just doing her job, wasn't she? When Captain James Thornton finally arrived at Mrs. Westwood's seat, he was polite but cautious. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said, offering a warm smile. I understand you wanted to speak with me. Mrs. Westwood nodded, her eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity. Yes, I do. I'd like to address a few things regarding the service on this flight, she said steadily. Yet there was something about the way she spoke that made Captain James Thornton pause. Olivia Taylor stood a few paces away, watching intently, her nervousness growing. Mrs. Westwood had not raised her voice, nor complained loudly. Yet somehow the situation was becoming much more serious than Olivia Taylor could have imagined. She had expected Mrs. Westwood to make a small fuss, but this was different. Something was off. Just as Olivia Taylor was about to step in and try to smooth things over, something unexpected happened that made her freeze in place. The captain, who had been listening patiently, glanced at Mrs. Westwood's boarding pass, which she had handed over when he asked to verify her identity. His expression shifted just slightly, but Olivia Taylor noticed it. He looked at Mrs. Westwood, and then back at her boarding pass again. I see, he said quietly. I wasn't aware. He turned to Olivia Taylor, his voice low but firm. Please excuse us for a moment. Olivia Taylor's heart skipped a beat. What was going on? Why was the captain suddenly taking the situation so seriously? And why, he said, I wasn't aware? She stood frozen as the captain continued to speak to Mrs. Eleanor Westwood, but she couldn't hear what they were saying. In that moment, Olivia Taylor had no idea how close she was to discovering the shocking truth. She couldn't have known that this quiet elderly woman was far more powerful than anyone could have guessed, and soon, Olivia Taylor would find out just how wrong she had been in judging Mrs. Eleanor Westwood. The captain spoke with Mrs. Eleanor Westwood for a few minutes in hushed tones, but Olivia Taylor couldn't make out the conversation. Her curiosity was getting the best of her, but she didn't dare interrupt. Instead, she stood there, trying to figure out what had just happened. The captain's demeanor had shifted completely from his usual easygoing self to someone who seemed cautious, almost reverential. After what felt like an eternity, Captain James Thornton gave Mrs. Eleanor Westwood a final nod, then turned to Olivia Taylor, his face now serious. Olivia Taylor, I need you to step aside for a moment, he said. The tone in his voice wasn't just polite, it was commanding. Olivia Taylor felt a slight jolt in her chest. She had never seen Captain James Thornton act like this before, especially not on such a minor issue. He was the kind of captain who joked with passengers and made small talk with the crew, so why was he acting this way? Is everything okay? Olivia Taylor asked, trying to sound more confident than she felt. Everything is fine, but I need to talk to you outside, Captain James Thornton said, motioning toward the galley area at the front of the plane. Olivia Taylor followed him, still confused. As they stepped into the small, cramped space of the galley, the hum of the plane's engines filled the silence between them. Captain James Thornton didn't waste any time. Do you know who that woman is? He asked, his voice lowered, his eyes narrowing with a look of disbelief. Olivia Taylor blinked, her mind racing. She's just a passenger, why? She began. Captain James Thornton ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated. She's not just any passenger, Olivia Taylor. She's Mrs. Eleanor Westwood, the owner of this airline. The words hit Olivia Taylor like a slap to the face. She blinked several times, trying to process what he had just said. The owner of the airline, the same elderly woman she had just dismissed as an ordinary, helpless traveler. I'm sorry, what? Olivia Taylor stammered, her mind still trying to catch up. How could you not have known? Captain James Thornton exhaled deeply, clearly struggling to remain calm. She's one of the most private people you'll ever meet. She doesn't advertise it, and she's never made a big deal out of it, but she owns the entire airline. This airline, Olivia Taylor. Olivia Taylor felt her stomach twist. The woman she had judged so harshly, the woman she had tried to force into switching seats, was the very person who had the power to fire her on the spot or worse, shut down the airline entirely. Olivia Taylor's heart raced as she thought back to the way she had spoken to Mrs. Eleanor Westwood. How condescending and dismissive she had been. I didn't know," Olivia Taylor whispered, her voice suddenly small. "That's the problem," Captain James Thornton said sharply. "You didn't know, and now you've made a mess of things. You disrespected her, Olivia Taylor. You didn't just make a mistake. You embarrassed her in front of the other passengers. She's had enough of people like you thinking they can get away with that kind of treatment." Olivia Taylor's mind was spinning. She felt heat rise in her cheeks as the reality of what had just happened sank in. She had always prided herself on being a good flight attendant, on being able to handle tough situations with grace and professionalism. But this time, she had failed miserably. "I'm so sorry," Olivia Taylor said, her voice faltering. "I never meant to. I didn't know. I didn't think." "Well, now you know," Captain James Thornton cut in, his tone softening just a bit. "And you need to understand that respect isn't just about doing your job. It's about how you treat people, no matter who they are. Mrs. Eleanor Westwood doesn't demand respect because of her wealth or status. She demands it because she's earned it." Olivia Taylor stood there, her face red with embarrassment. She wanted to apologize to make things right, but she knew it was too late for that. She had crossed a line, and now the only thing she could do was try to learn from her mistake. Captain James Thornton took a deep breath and looked at Olivia Taylor. "I don't know what's going to happen next, but I suggest you stay out of Mrs. Eleanor Westwood's way for the rest of the flight, and you better pray she doesn't ask to speak to someone higher up when we land." With that, he turned on his heel and walked back toward the main cabin, leaving Olivia Taylor standing in the galley, stunned. She couldn't shake the image of Mrs. Eleanor Westwood sitting there, so composed and calm, while Olivia Taylor had been the one to make a scene. Now, as she stood there, the weight of the situation pressed down on her, and she had no idea what consequences lay ahead, but she had a sinking feeling they weren't going to be good. Little did Olivia Taylor know, the moment she had just set in motion would change everything. Mrs. Eleanor Westwood wasn't a woman to be dismissed lightly, and she wasn't the kind of person who would forget such an insult. As the plane continued its flight, a storm was quietly brewing, and Olivia Taylor was at the center of it. As the flight continued, Olivia Taylor tried her best to put the conversation with Captain James Thornton out of her mind. But it wasn't easy. Every time she walked down the aisle, she couldn't help but glance over at Mrs. Eleanor Westwood, who still sat quietly in her seat as though nothing had happened. The rest of the passengers had settled into their routines as well, but the atmosphere felt different now. Tension hung in the air, though no one could quite put their finger on why. Olivia Taylor's mind raced as she went about her duties. How could she have been so careless? How could she have disrespected someone who was in fact the owner of the entire airline? She had always been trained to treat all passengers with respect, no matter their background. But it had never crossed her mind that someone like Mrs. Eleanor Westwood, an older, unassuming woman, could be a major figure. Olivia Taylor's pride had clouded her judgment, and now she had to live with the consequences. As she passed Mrs. Eleanor Westwood's seat again, Olivia Taylor noticed the elderly woman wasn't looking out the window anymore. Instead, her hands were folded neatly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the magazine she had opened in front of her. Olivia Taylor felt a pang of guilt wash over her. She had no idea how to approach the situation. What could she possibly say to make up for the way she had treated Mrs. Eleanor Westwood? "Ma'am," Olivia Taylor said hesitantly, her voice shaky as she spoke. I just want to apologize for earlier. I didn't know who you were, and I was out of line." She could barely meet Mrs. Eleanor Westwood's gaze. "I'm really sorry," Olivia Taylor continued. Mrs. Eleanor Westwood didn't respond right away. She simply turned a page in her magazine, her expression neutral for a moment. Olivia Taylor thought that Mrs. Eleanor Westwood might ignore her completely. But then the elderly woman spoke, her voice calm, but with a quiet weight behind it. "I don't expect an apology from people who don't understand the impact of their actions," Mrs. Eleanor Westwood said softly. "But I do hope you'll learn from this and treat others with the respect they deserve, no matter their age or appearance." Olivia Taylor nodded quickly, her heart sinking. I will," she said earnestly. "I promise." There was a long pause before Mrs. Eleanor Westwood finally looked up from her magazine. Her eyes were steady, her gaze piercing, yet somehow kind. "I believe you will," she said, her tone softer now, almost like a mother offering advice to a child who had made a mistake. "But don't forget, true respect isn't something that's given because of who someone is in the moment. It's something you show every day, to everyone." Olivia Taylor stood there, silent for a moment, processing the words. She had expected anger, maybe a reprimand. But Mrs. Eleanor Westwood's response was something different. It was almost like a quiet lesson, one Olivia Taylor knew she wouldn't forget anytime soon. Before Olivia Taylor could say anything else, the captain approached again, his expression unreadable. He glanced at Olivia Taylor and then at Mrs. Eleanor Westwood, before turning his attention back to the aisle. "Mrs. Eleanor Westwood, Captain James Thornton," he said with a respectful nod. "We'll be landing in about 30 minutes. Is there anything else I can do for you before we arrive?" Mrs. Eleanor Westwood gave a small, polite smile. "No, Captain. I believe I've had everything I need." With that, Captain James Thornton turned and walked back toward the front of the plane, leaving Olivia Taylor standing next to Mrs. Eleanor Westwood. The flight was almost over, but Olivia Taylor couldn't shake the feeling that something important was about to happen. The weight of the apology and the lessons she had learned still lingered. But there was one more thing hanging over her head, something she could not have anticipated. As the plane began its descent, the flight attendant started preparing for landing. But Olivia Taylor felt a tight knot in her stomach. She couldn't help but wonder what Mrs. Eleanor Westwood would do next. Would she let the whole incident slide, or was there something more in store for Olivia Taylor? Something that would make her understand the gravity of her mistake once and for all. The answer, as it turned out, would come when the plane touched down on the tarmac in New York. The usual excitement of arrival buzzed in the air. Passengers began unbuckling their seatbelts, grabbing their bags from the overhead compartments, and preparing for the long walk through the terminal. But for Olivia Taylor, the mood was anything but celebratory. The weight of her mistake still hung over her, and with each passing second, her nerves grew worse. She couldn't stop thinking about the conversation with Captain James Thornton and the apology to Mrs. Eleanor Westwood. What had she learned? She had apologized, sure, but was that enough? When the plane finally came to a stop and the seatbelt sign clicked off, Olivia Taylor started to move down the aisle to help passengers disembark. But as she passed by Mrs. Eleanor Westwood's seat, she noticed something different. Mrs. Eleanor Westwood wasn't in her seat anymore. The elderly woman had already stood up, her small carry-on bag in hand, and was walking toward the front of the plane. For a moment, Olivia Taylor thought she might have been imagining things, but then Mrs. Eleanor Westwood caught her eye. She smiled, but there was something about the smile. It wasn't a warm smile. It wasn't the kind of smile someone gives when they forgive you. It was something far more calculated, almost like she knew something Olivia Taylor didn't. Before Olivia Taylor could say anything, Mrs. Eleanor Westwood stopped in front of her and spoke in a soft, deliberate voice. "I hope you've learned your lesson, Olivia Taylor," she said, her tone even but heavy with meaning. "Because I believe in second chances, but I also believe in accountability." Olivia Taylor's stomach dropped. Mrs. Eleanor Westwood knew her name. Had she been watching her that closely? But before Olivia Taylor could ask, Mrs. Eleanor Westwood continued, "I'll be making sure this issue is addressed." Her words were slow but firm. "And I'll be reaching out to the higher-ups at the airline. I think they'll want to hear about what happened today." Olivia Taylor's heart skipped a beat. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Mrs. Eleanor Westwood wasn't letting this go. The apology hadn't been enough to erase the mistake. Far from it. Mrs. Eleanor Westwood was going to take action, and Olivia Taylor knew exactly what that meant. The consequences were coming, and they wouldn't be pretty. "But ma'am," Olivia Taylor stammered, her voice trembling. Mrs. Eleanor Westwood raised a hand, cutting her off. "I understand you're sorry, Olivia Taylor," she said, "but apologies don't always undo harm. The people who get to make the decisions about your future are the ones you need to impress now, and I think you'll find that they take respect very seriously." With that, Mrs. Eleanor Westwood turned away and walked toward the front of the plane, her small steps measured and purposeful. Olivia Taylor stood frozen in place, the blood draining from her face. She had expected an apology to be the end of it, a quiet resolution to a tense situation. But now it seemed like the beginning of something far worse. As Mrs. Eleanor Westwood reached the front, Olivia Taylor could hear her speaking to the crew in quiet tones. She wasn't raising her voice or causing a scene, but the way the captain and other flight attendants reacted told Olivia Taylor all she needed to know. There was a certain reverence in their body language, a kind of nervousness that hadn't been there earlier. They were all treating her differently now, as if something about her had shifted in their eyes. Olivia Taylor's palms began to sweat. Her mind raced. What could she possibly do to make this right? It wasn't like she could just go to Mrs. Eleanor Westwood now and beg for forgiveness. It was too late for that. And if Mrs. Eleanor Westwood really was going to take this up with the higher-ups, Olivia Taylor's position at the airline might be at risk. She had already embarrassed herself. But now the stakes were much higher. Just as she was about to step forward, Captain James Thornton appeared beside her, his expression serious. "Olivia Taylor," he said quietly, "I suggest you sit tight for now. Mrs. Eleanor Westwood is having a private conversation with the senior staff. She's not angry, but she's not going to let this go either." Olivia Taylor nodded, the reality of the situation sinking in. Her apology, her attempt to make things right, didn't matter anymore. She had made a mistake, and now she would have to face the consequences for the rest of the disembarking process. Olivia Taylor barely noticed the passengers as they left the plane. Her mind was consumed with thoughts of what would happen next. How could she possibly explain herself? How could she have been so blind? As the last of the passengers trickled off the plane, Olivia Taylor was left standing in the cabin, waiting for her fate to unfold. She could feel the eyes of the crew on her, the weight of their silence pressing down on her like a heavy cloak. They all knew now. Mrs. Eleanor Westwood's quiet power had shifted the entire dynamic, and Olivia Taylor had no idea just how far-reaching the consequences of her actions were about to be. As the last of the passengers stepped off, the cabin was eerily quiet. Olivia Taylor stood still, her hands gripping the armrest of one of the seats, her mind in a fog. She had hoped that once the passengers were gone, the tension would ease, but it only seemed to build. The crew moved about the plane, performing their post-flight duties, but Olivia Taylor couldn't focus on anything. Every thought kept returning to Mrs. Eleanor Westwood, her calm demeanor, the quiet but deliberate way she had spoken to her. After a few minutes, Captain James Thornton came over to her, his expression unchanged. He didn't look angry, but there was a coldness in his eyes that told Olivia Taylor this wasn't going to be a simple matter. He gestured for her to follow him, and she did so without protest, her heart pounding in her chest as they walked toward the cockpit. But before they reached the door, Captain James Thornton stopped and turned to face her, his voice low and firm. "Olivia Taylor, you need to understand that what happened back there wasn't just about the seating arrangement or a minor complaint," he said, his eyes narrowing. "This is bigger than that. You made a judgment call based on assumptions, and now you've put us all in a tough spot." Olivia Taylor swallowed hard, nodding as she felt the weight of his words. She had made assumptions. She had assumed that Mrs. Eleanor Westwood was just another elderly woman, easy to dismiss and overlook. She had assumed that because Mrs. Eleanor Westwood wasn't making a scene or demanding special treatment, she didn't deserve any. But now, all those assumptions had come crashing down, and the consequences were real. "I didn't realize who she was," Olivia Taylor said quietly, her voice trembling. "I never should have treated her like that." "I understand that now," Captain James Thornton replied, studying her for a moment before speaking again. "It's not just about realizing your mistake, Olivia Taylor. It's about how we handle it moving forward. Mrs. Eleanor Westwood is someone who doesn't like to make a fuss. She's not the type to broadcast her power, but she has a lot of influence, and she'll use it if she feels disrespected. You crossed a line, and now the people at the top will need to decide how to handle it." Olivia Taylor's stomach churned as she felt the reality of the situation settling into her bones. It wasn't just about the flight anymore. It was about her job, her career here, and the trust she had just broken. Captain James Thornton continued, his voice steady but filled with a sense of finality. "I'm not saying this is the end for you, Olivia Taylor, but I need you to understand that Mrs. Eleanor Westwood is not someone you can dismiss. She's a person who values respect, and she expects it from everyone, regardless of their position." Olivia Taylor nodded again, feeling like her world had just been turned upside down. She had no idea how to make this right, or if she even could. Just as she was about to speak, the door to the cockpit opened, and one of the senior flight managers stepped out, looking a little more serious than usual. He glanced at Olivia Taylor and then at Captain James Thornton before addressing them both. "Captain James Thornton, Olivia Taylor," he said in an all-business tone. "Mrs. Eleanor Westwood would like to speak with you both in my office immediately." The words hit Olivia Taylor like a wave. Mrs. Eleanor Westwood was already speaking to the senior staff. Olivia Taylor's hands clenched into fists as she followed Captain James Thornton down the narrow aisle, the tension building with each step. She could barely breathe. She had been preparing herself for some kind of reprimand, but this felt different. Mrs. Eleanor Westwood had already gone straight to the top. She wasn't giving Olivia Taylor a chance to explain herself anymore. They reached the terminal gate, where Mrs. Eleanor Westwood stood waiting, looking more composed than ever. Beside her were two other high-ranking executives from the airline, their faces unreadable. Olivia Taylor felt her legs go weak. This was it. This was the moment she had feared. Mrs. Eleanor Westwood didn't look at Olivia Taylor right away. Instead, she exchanged a few words with the executives before turning her gaze slowly toward the young flight attendant. There was no anger in her eyes, but there was something else. Something that made Olivia Taylor feel as though she were standing in front of a judge, awaiting a verdict. "Olivia Taylor," Mrs. Eleanor Westwood said, her voice calm and measured. "I trust you understand the gravity of what happened today." Olivia Taylor could barely speak, but she managed to whisper, "Yes, ma'am, I understand." Mrs. Eleanor Westwood paused for a moment, studying her. "Good," she said at last, "because I don't expect you to make the same mistake again. Respect, integrity, and humility are non-negotiable in this airline. And in life." Olivia Taylor nodded, her throat dry. Mrs. Eleanor Westwood wasn't shouting at her. She wasn't even raising her voice. But the weight of her words made Olivia Taylor feel smaller than she had ever felt before. Then, Mrs. Eleanor Westwood turned to the executives. "I would like to ensure that this doesn't happen again," she said, her voice as firm as iron. "And I expect to see a change in how we train our staff to handle passengers. No exceptions." The executives nodded, taking note of her words. They had been silent up until this point, but it was clear that they were taking Mrs. Eleanor Westwood's instructions seriously. This wasn't just about a mistake. This was about setting a precedent. Olivia Taylor had not only embarrassed herself, she had created a ripple that could affect the entire airline. Mrs. Eleanor Westwood then turned back to Olivia Taylor. "I'll be leaving now, but I hope you've learned something valuable today." Olivia Taylor could barely find her voice. "I have," she said softly. "I won't forget this." Mrs. Eleanor Westwood nodded once, her eyes softening for a brief moment, before she turned and walked out of the gate, leaving Olivia Taylor standing there, her heart heavy with the weight of her actions, as the door closed behind her. The silence in the room was deafening. Olivia Taylor stood still, knowing her life at the airline would never be the same. But the lesson she had learned, the hard, painful lesson, was something that would stay with her forever. She had crossed a line, and now it was time to pay the price. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Olivia Taylor tried to go through the motions of her usual routine, helping with post-flight paperwork and preparing for the next shift. But her mind was miles away. Her thoughts kept returning to Mrs. Eleanor Westwood and the quiet power she held. Olivia Taylor had seen people with authority before, managers, supervisors, executives, but none of them carried the same weight as Mrs. Eleanor Westwood. She wasn't loud or boastful. She didn't have to command attention to be noticed. No, she simply existed with a quiet confidence that made it clear she was someone who couldn't be ignored. As the hours passed, Olivia Taylor's anxiety only grew. She kept replaying the events in her mind, wondering if she could have done anything differently. She couldn't shake the image of Mrs. Eleanor Westwood standing there, poised and composed, while Olivia Taylor had been the one to make a scene. By the time her shift was over, Olivia Taylor felt exhausted. It wasn't the kind of tiredness you get from a long day of work, but the kind that comes from knowing you've made a mistake that's impossible to undo. She gathered her things and headed for the crew room, hoping to unwind before heading home. But as she walked in, she saw Captain James Thornton waiting for her. "Hey, Olivia Taylor," he said, his tone more neutral than before. "Can we talk for a minute?" Olivia Taylor nodded silently, her stomach flipping again. She knew what was coming. She had expected it, but now that it was here, she felt a lump rise in her throat. She followed him to a quiet corner of the crew room, away from the other staff, who were chatting or getting ready for their next flight. "How are you holding up?" Captain James Thornton asked, his voice soft. "I don't know," Olivia Taylor admitted. "I keep thinking about what Mrs. Eleanor Westwood said, and I'm worried about what's going to happen next." Captain James Thornton gave her a thoughtful look. "I know it's hard, but you've got to understand something. What happened today wasn't just about you disrespecting a passenger. That's part of it, sure, but more importantly, it's about how we as crew members represent the airline. Mrs. Eleanor Westwood runs this airline. She has a personal stake in how things go, and when something goes wrong, she's not going to let it slide. It's not about being harsh. It's about ensuring standards are upheld." Olivia Taylor nodded, absorbing his words. She had heard it before, the company line about representing the airline, maintaining customer service standards, and adhering to rules. But somehow this time, it felt heavier. It wasn't just corporate policy. This time it felt like her job, her future, was hanging in the balance. "I get that," Olivia Taylor said quietly. "I just don't know what to expect now. Will I be fired? Will they discipline me?" Captain James Thornton looked at her carefully. "I don't know. Mrs. Eleanor Westwood hasn't made any decisions yet, but I can tell you this. The fact that she didn't blow up or create a scene says a lot. She could have easily taken this to a much higher level. Instead, she's trying to teach you a lesson, not ruin your career." Olivia Taylor let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. There was a slight sense of relief, but it didn't last long. She still didn't know what Mrs. Eleanor Westwood's next move would be, and that uncertainty unnerved her. "I can't promise anything," Captain James Thornton continued, "but I can tell you this. The higher-ups value respect. They'll respect the way you handle this moving forward and how you approach the situation from now on. How you handle yourself when things go wrong. That's going to matter more than the mistake you made." Olivia Taylor's mind raced. What did that mean? Could she fix this? Was there still a chance for redemption? "I don't know how to fix it," she said quietly. "I've messed up, and I don't even know where to start." "Start by owning it," Captain James Thornton said simply. "You've already apologized, and that's important, but the real test is what you do next. Are you going to take responsibility for your actions and learn from this, or are you going to shy away from it and hope it goes away?" Olivia Taylor paused. He was right. The mistake had been made, but she could still control how she responded. She didn't need to hide from it. She didn't need to pretend it didn't happen. What mattered now was what she did with the lesson she had learned. "I'll own it," she said, her voice stronger now. "I'll make things right. I'm not going to let this define me." Captain James Thornton gave a small nod, his expression softening just a little. "Good, that's the right attitude, and you know, Mrs. Eleanor Westwood doesn't hold grudges. She's tough, but she's fair. If you show her you've learned something from this, she'll respect that." Olivia Taylor felt a flicker of hope. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to make things right. As they talked for a few more minutes, Olivia Taylor started to feel a bit of clarity. But she couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. What would Mrs. Eleanor Westwood do? Would she really be given a second chance, or would this mistake be the end of her time with the airline? As she left the crew room that evening, Olivia Taylor knew she had to wait. Wait for the next step, for the fallout, for the consequences of her actions. And above all, she knew that how she handled what came next would define her future. But for the first time in hours, Olivia Taylor felt like she had a chance. A real chance. To learn from her mistakes and make things right. She was determined to prove to Mrs. Eleanor Westwood and to herself that she could live up to the respect and professionalism that the job required. The next few days were a blur of uncertainty. Olivia Taylor went through her daily routine on autopilot, checking in with the crew, handling in-flight services, and trying to act normal, though nothing about her situation felt normal. Every time she saw Mrs. Eleanor Westwood's name mentioned in company emails or heard whispers about the incident, her stomach tightened. She couldn't escape it. Her mistake was no longer just a personal misstep. It was becoming part of the airline's history. Everyone was talking about it, even if they weren't saying her name outright. The story had spread, and she was the center of it all. It wasn't until her next scheduled flight that Olivia Taylor finally felt like the weight of her mistake was about to come down on her. Captain James Thornton had pulled her aside before they boarded. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were firm. "Olivia Taylor, we need to talk," he said quietly, his voice low. "About what?" Olivia Taylor asked, her nerves instantly spiking. "Mrs. Eleanor Westwood called this morning," Captain James Thornton began. "She wanted to know how you've been doing, and she asked for a follow-up. She said she'd be keeping an eye on your progress." "I don't know what that means exactly, but it's clear she's giving you a chance," Olivia Taylor said, her heart racing. "She's not going to fire you," Captain James Thornton shook his head. "Not as of now, but make no mistake. She's watching. She's not a woman who's easily fooled. She wants to see if you can handle the responsibility of this job with the respect it requires, and she'll make a decision based on that." Olivia Taylor nodded, feeling the sting of her previous mistake still fresh. She had hoped Mrs. Eleanor Westwood might have forgotten or at least let it slide, but that was never going to happen. Mrs. Eleanor Westwood wasn't the type to just forgive and forget. She was the type to test someone's character, to see if they would rise to the occasion. As the plane took off, Olivia Taylor could hardly concentrate. She went through the motions, serving drinks, chatting with passengers, and smiling when necessary. But her mind was constantly pulled back to the conversation she had had with Captain James Thornton. Mrs. Eleanor Westwood hadn't just left it at the incident. She had actively sought out Olivia Taylor's progress, which meant that this wasn't over. The pressure was on, and Olivia Taylor knew she had to prove herself in ways that were far beyond just a simple apology. It wasn't until the flight was almost halfway through that Olivia Taylor received an unexpected message. The phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out, surprised to see that it was from the airline's HR department. Her hands shook as she opened the email. The subject line was simple: follow-up on incident. She felt her breath catch in her throat as she read, "Dear Olivia Taylor, thank you for your patience as we review the recent incident on Flight 347. We have taken into consideration the details of the situation, as well as the feedback provided by Captain James Thornton and other staff members. Based on our review, we would like to offer you the opportunity to discuss the matter further in a one-on-one meeting with Mrs. Eleanor Westwood, who has personally requested this session. This meeting will be held at our corporate offices in New York tomorrow afternoon, and we expect it to be a constructive conversation. Mrs. Westwood has indicated that she is open to understanding your perspective and will provide you with feedback regarding your future with the airline. Please respond at your earliest convenience to confirm your attendance. Sincerely, HR Department. Olivia Taylor's hands trembled as she put the phone down. She felt a mix of dread and a flicker of hope. A meeting with Mrs. Eleanor Westwood. This wasn't just a casual check-in, this was going to be serious. And yet, part of her, just a small part, was relieved. Mrs. Eleanor Westwood hadn't closed the door completely. She was still willing to listen to Olivia Taylor out. But there was no denying that this meeting could determine everything. As the flight continued, Olivia Taylor replayed the incident over and over in her head, trying to figure out what she would say to Mrs. Eleanor Westwood. What would she say when she came face to face with the woman who owned the airline? The woman she had disrespected. How could she explain herself? And how could she convince Mrs. Eleanor Westwood that she was worthy of the second chance she had been given? By the time the flight landed, Olivia Taylor had barely been able to focus on the passengers. She knew she had to be prepared for whatever Mrs. Eleanor Westwood would say. This meeting was more than just an apology. It was a test of her character, her professionalism, and her ability to grow from her mistakes. There was no room for excuses. It was all about what she had learned and whether she was truly capable of earning back the trust she had broken that night. She barely slept. The anxiety of the upcoming meeting weighed on her. But she knew one thing for sure: this was her chance to show that she had learned, to prove to Mrs. Eleanor Westwood and to herself that she was more than just the sum of her mistakes. The next morning, Olivia Taylor dressed carefully, choosing her uniform with purpose. She wanted to appear confident but not cocky, professional but humble. She couldn't afford to make another misstep. As she stood in front of the corporate offices later that afternoon, waiting for the meeting to begin, Olivia Taylor couldn't help but wonder. Would this be the moment she proved herself? Or would it mark the end of her career at the airline? She didn't know, but she was ready to find out. The lobby of the corporate office was sleek and modern, the kind of place that felt both intimidating and impressive. Olivia Taylor stood by the glass doors, her palms sweating despite the cool air conditioning. She had arrived early, hoping to give herself a moment to calm her nerves before facing Mrs. Eleanor Westwood. She didn't know what to expect, but everything she'd learned about the woman over the past few days suggested that this meeting was about more than just an apology. It was about accountability, growth, and understanding the weight of one's actions. A receptionist at the front desk smiled at her, her professionalism making Olivia Taylor feel even more out of place. The receptionist didn't ask any questions. She just gestured for Olivia Taylor to take a seat in the lobby area, where soft instrumental music played in the background. The minutes dragged on, each second feeling like an eternity. Every time the elevator doors opened, Olivia Taylor's heart skipped a beat. But it was never Mrs. Eleanor Westwood. Eventually, after what felt like hours, the elevator doors opened again. This time, a tall woman in a black suit stepped out, her posture upright and commanding. Olivia Taylor didn't have to look twice. She knew who it was. Mrs. Eleanor Westwood, the woman who owned the airline. Mrs. Eleanor Westwood's eyes met Olivia Taylor's immediately, and Olivia Taylor felt a lump rise in her throat. She stood quickly, but Mrs. Eleanor Westwood raised a hand, signaling for her to stay seated. The older woman's face was unreadable, but her presence was undeniable. "Olivia Taylor," Mrs. Eleanor Westwood said, her voice low but steady. "I trust you're ready for this conversation." Olivia Taylor nodded, feeling her nerves surge again. This was it, the moment that would decide her future with the airline. Mrs. Eleanor Westwood motioned for her to follow, leading Olivia Taylor through the sleek halls and into a small private conference room. It was simple, no frills, but the air inside was thick with expectation. As they both sat down at the table, Mrs. Eleanor Westwood folded her hands and looked at Olivia Taylor with those same steady eyes. "I'll get straight to the point, Olivia Taylor," Mrs. Eleanor Westwood said, her voice calm but firm. "You made a mistake on that flight, a big one, and you know it. But what I'm more concerned about is what you're going to do about it." Olivia Taylor's heart raced. but she forced herself to meet Mrs. Eleanor Westwood's gaze. "I understand, ma'am," she said, her voice quiet but determined. "I made an assumption. I treated you, and I'm sure others, without the respect you deserve, and I regret it deeply. I know I can't take it back, but I'm here to show you that I've learned from it." Mrs. Eleanor Westwood's eyes didn't waver as she listened, but her expression softened slightly. "I don't need you to apologize again, Olivia Taylor. What I need to know is this: are you willing to change? Are you capable of putting aside your pride and becoming the kind of person who can genuinely earn respect, not just because of your position, but because of who you are and how you treat others?" Olivia Taylor felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She wasn't sure if it was fear, guilt, or just the weight of the moment, but it made her voice falter. I am. I will. I understand now that respect isn't something that's given just because of who I am, or because I think I deserve it. It's earned by how I treat people, whether they're passengers, crew members, or anyone else. Mrs. Eleanor Westwood leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing as if measuring Olivia Taylor's sincerity. "That's a good answer, but the truth is, Olivia Taylor, this goes beyond just being nice to people. This is about taking responsibility for your actions. It's about understanding that your behavior impacts not just yourself, but everyone around you. One small act can create ripples, and those ripples can either strengthen the company or tear it apart. Do you understand that?" Mrs. Eleanor Westwood asked. "Yes, ma'am," Olivia Taylor said, her voice steady. "Now I do understand. I understand more than ever before that the airline isn't just a place where I work. It's a community. The people who fly with us, the staff and the passengers, are all part of something bigger. It isn't just about serving drinks or making sure the safety instructions are followed. It is about treating people with dignity, no matter their status or background." "Good," Mrs. Eleanor Westwood replied. "But words alone won't prove anything. Actions speak louder. That's why I'm giving you this opportunity, Olivia Taylor. I want to see how you handle yourself moving forward. You've apologized, and I've heard your words. Now I want to see what you do next." Olivia Taylor nodded again, her heart beating faster. She didn't know exactly what Mrs. Eleanor Westwood expected, but she knew this was a test she couldn't fail. She had to show that she could be trusted, that she was capable of earning back the respect she had lost. "Thank you for giving me this chance," Olivia Taylor said earnestly. "I won't let you down." Mrs. Eleanor Westwood stood up and walked toward the door, but before she left, she turned to look at Olivia Taylor one last time. "I'll be watching, Olivia Taylor, but I'm not doing it out of punishment. I'm doing it because I believe people can change if they truly want to. Don't disappoint me." With that, Mrs. Eleanor Westwood left the room, leaving Olivia Taylor alone with her thoughts for the first time in days. Olivia Taylor felt a sense of clarity. Mrs. Eleanor Westwood hadn't given her a simple pass. She hadn't just forgotten what happened. Instead, she had given her the opportunity to prove herself, to show that she had learned and grown. Olivia Taylor didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. She would do whatever it took to prove that she was worthy of the chance she had been given. As she walked out of the conference room and back into the hallway, Olivia Taylor felt a newfound determination. She wasn't going to waste this opportunity. She would earn her place, one step at a time. The road ahead might be difficult, but she was ready. And this time, she wouldn't make the same mistake again. The next few weeks were a blur of hard work, self-reflection, and constant effort. Olivia Taylor was determined to prove to Mrs. Eleanor Westwood that she could learn from her mistake. But the road wasn't easy. Every moment, every interaction felt like it was being scrutinized. And in a way, it was. But this time, it wasn't just about avoiding mistakes. It was about being proactive, showing genuine respect for everyone around her, not just in public moments, but in every tiny detail. Olivia Taylor started paying attention to things she had never considered before. The tone of her voice when interacting with passengers, the way she responded to complaints, how she treated the crew members who were often overlooked. She realized how many little opportunities she had missed to make people feel valued and respected. Every flight became a chance to demonstrate her growth and her commitment to change. It wasn't enough to just do her job. She had to do it with integrity, humility, and a deep sense of responsibility. Captain James Thornton noticed the shift almost immediately. He had always been a mentor to her, but now he took a more active role in guiding her through these changes. He would often pull her aside after flights to give constructive feedback, praising her when she handled situations well and gently correcting her when she faltered. The support was exactly what she needed to rebuild her confidence and sense of purpose. One afternoon after a particularly challenging flight, Olivia Taylor sat with Captain James Thornton in the crew lounge. She had just diffused a tense situation with a passenger who was unhappy with the seating arrangement, and she felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. "You handled that well," Captain James Thornton said, nodding his approval. "I can tell you've been taking this seriously. Your patience with the passengers, especially the ones who are difficult, is exactly what this job requires." Olivia Taylor smiled slightly, her eyes filled with determination. "I've been trying. I know I have a lot to make up for, but I'm not just doing it for Mrs. Eleanor Westwood or anyone else. I'm doing it for myself. I want to be the kind of person who deserves respect, not just for my job, but for how I treat others." Captain James Thornton gave her a long, measured look. "That's exactly the right mindset. You've got the right attitude now, Olivia Taylor. Just keep it up. Remember, this isn't about perfection. It's about progress." Olivia Taylor nodded, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders for the first time in weeks. She felt like she was moving forward, not just through the motions, but with purpose. A few days later, as Olivia Taylor prepared for another flight, she got an unexpected email from the HR department. It was short, but the words felt as though they carried a heavy weight. "Dear Olivia Taylor, we are writing to inform you that Mrs. Eleanor Westwood has reviewed your performance over the past several weeks. She has been impressed with your progress and the changes she has seen in your approach to the job. Based on this, she has decided to offer you continued employment with the company. She wishes to acknowledge your efforts and looks forward to seeing you continue to grow with the airline." Olivia Taylor read the email 3 times, barely able to process the words. A second chance. An actual second chance. Mrs. Eleanor Westwood wasn't just letting her off the hook. She had recognized the work Olivia Taylor had put in to change and had decided to allow her to continue. Her heart swelled with a mixture of relief and pride. She had done it. She had earned back the opportunity to prove herself. Not just to Mrs. Eleanor Westwood, but to everyone at the airline and, most importantly, to herself. For the rest of the day, Olivia Taylor couldn't stop smiling. She was determined to continue on the path she had started. Not because it was easy, but because it was the right thing to do. This wasn't the end of her journey. It was just the beginning. The weeks that followed the email felt like a new chapter in Olivia Taylor's life. Every flight was a fresh opportunity to demonstrate that she had learned her lesson and could be trusted again. And with each passing day, she felt more confident in her ability to balance professionalism with genuine kindness. Olivia Taylor knew she could never completely erase the mistakes she had made with Mrs. Eleanor Westwood. But she also knew that growth wasn't about perfection. It was about the willingness to change, to do better, and to learn from your past. Every time she interacted with a passenger, every time she handled a situation that would have once frustrated her, she reminded herself of the importance of staying grounded in humility and respect. One afternoon, several months after that pivotal meeting with Mrs. Eleanor Westwood, Olivia Taylor found herself walking down the jet bridge, ready to board a flight for a routine destination. As she made her way to the cabin, she caught sight of a familiar face sitting in the first row. It was Mrs. Eleanor Westwood, the woman who had nearly ended her career, but who had also given her the greatest gift she could have hoped for: a second chance. Mrs. Eleanor Westwood glanced up as Olivia Taylor approached, her expression unreadable, but there was a slight smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Olivia Taylor stood tall, her posture confident but respectful, and made her way to the aisle. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Eleanor Westwood," she said, her voice steady. "It's a pleasure to have you on board." Mrs. Eleanor Westwood nodded, her gaze softening just a bit. "Good afternoon, Olivia Taylor. I see you're doing well." Olivia Taylor smiled, her heart swelling. It wasn't just the words that mattered, it was the fact that Mrs. Eleanor Westwood had noticed the change. There was a quiet acknowledgement between them, an unspoken understanding that they both knew what had happened, and how far Olivia Taylor had come. "I'm glad to see you here, ma'am, Olivia Taylor," she added. "Thank you for giving me the chance to prove myself." Mrs. Eleanor Westwood's gaze lingered on Olivia Taylor for a moment longer, and then she nodded, her eyes sharp but approving. "You've earned it, Olivia Taylor. Keep it up." Mrs. Eleanor Westwood returned to her seat, and Olivia Taylor went about the rest of the flight feeling more at peace than she had in a long time. She knew that she still had work to do, but for the first time in a long time she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, on the right path, doing the right thing, and earning the respect she had worked so hard to rebuild. And this time, she knew she wouldn't make the same mistake again. As Olivia Taylor moved through the months that followed, her sense of purpose only deepened. The journey of growth that had begun with her initial mistake had become an integral part of who she was. Every aspect of her job, from handling delicate customer interactions to working closely with the crew, had transformed. She had grown more patient, more attentive, and most importantly, more empathetic. Every passenger she encountered was treated with respect, not because of their status, but simply because they deserved it. Every small gesture of kindness, whether a smile or a thoughtful conversation, was a reflection of the lessons she had learned. She had also come to realize that her relationship with Mrs. Eleanor Westwood, though brief, had fundamentally changed her. The woman who once seemed so distant, so above her, had shown her something deeper than just power or authority. Mrs. Eleanor Westwood had demonstrated that true leadership wasn't about asserting dominance. It was about guiding others, holding them accountable, and providing the chance for real redemption. Olivia Taylor found herself more connected to her colleagues too. She was no longer the flight attendant who rushed through her duties, focusing only on getting through the shift. She was now a part of a team, one that supported each other not just for the sake of efficiency, but for mutual respect. When new staff members came on board, she made sure to mentor them, showing them the importance of patience, respect, and accountability, much in the same way Captain James Thornton had done for her. Her relationship with Captain James Thornton had also evolved. The once distant mentor-mentee dynamic had shifted into one of mutual respect. He had seen her struggle, but he had also witnessed her growth, and now they shared a camaraderie built on experience, trust, and a shared understanding of what it meant to lead by example. They were no longer just colleagues. They were partners in ensuring the flight crew maintained the high standards they both believed in. One afternoon, after another smooth flight, Olivia Taylor sat with Captain James Thornton in the crew lounge, as they often did after the last passengers had disembarked. This time, however, the mood felt different. Lighter, almost celebratory. "Well, I think it's safe to say," Captain James Thornton said with a grin, "you finally earned your place, Olivia Taylor." Olivia Taylor laughed softly, though there was a hint of seriousness in her tone. "I'm still working at it, Captain. I don't think I'll ever stop, but I do feel like I've found my footing again. I'm in a better place now." Captain James Thornton nodded approvingly. "You've come a long way. I knew from the start that you had the potential to be great. You just had to learn to trust yourself and put the work in, and you did. Not many people would have turned that situation around the way you did." Olivia Taylor took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words. She had worked hard, but she had also been lucky. Lucky that Mrs. Eleanor Westwood had believed in second chances. Lucky that she had the support of people like Captain James Thornton. And lucky that she had learned the importance of humility and personal growth. "It wasn't just me," she replied thoughtfully. "I've learned that we all need each other, especially when we mess up. The way the team rallied around me. The way Mrs. Eleanor Westwood gave me that chance. I didn't do it alone." Captain James Thornton smiled. "That's the right attitude. You understand now what makes a great team. It's not about the individual. It's about how we work together, how we learn from each other, and how we lift each other up." Olivia Taylor nodded, a sense of fulfillment filling her chest. She had finally found her balance. She had learned from her mistakes, made meaningful changes in her behavior, and embraced the responsibility of leadership, not just in her job, but in her life. The following weeks flew by, and Olivia Taylor found herself gaining more and more confidence. She was still cautious, still aware of her past mistakes, but she was no longer haunted by them. She had found a new sense of purpose, not because of some perfect outcome, but because she had earned her place. It wasn't just about Mrs. Eleanor Westwood's approval anymore. It was about the kind of person she wanted to be and the legacy she wanted to leave, not just at the airline, but in every interaction she had. Then one day, as Olivia Taylor was preparing for another routine flight, she was called into the office by HR. She wasn't nervous anymore, not like she would have been months ago. She knew that no matter what happened, she had earned the right to face whatever was coming with grace. When she walked into the office, Mrs. Eleanor Westwood was sitting behind the desk, her expression unreadable. The HR representative was standing beside her, also serious but polite. Olivia Taylor could feel her heart race, but she kept her composure. "Olivia Taylor," Mrs. Eleanor Westwood said, looking up from a folder on her desk. "I've been monitoring your progress for several months now, and I have to say, what I've seen is impressive. You've not only restored the trust you lost, but you've also gone beyond that. You've become a true example of what we expect from every member of this airline." Olivia Taylor blinked, surprised by the praise, but she knew better than to let it go to her head. She had worked hard for this moment, but she wasn't done yet. "Thank you, ma'am," Olivia Taylor said respectfully, her voice steady. "I've worked hard to earn back the trust that was lost, but I know that I have to keep proving myself every day." Mrs. Eleanor Westwood nodded approvingly. "And you will, but as of today, I'm pleased to offer you a promotion. I want you to step into a leadership role within the flight crew. You've demonstrated the qualities we value most: responsibility, humility, and a commitment to excellence. I believe you're ready." Olivia Taylor's breath caught in her chest. A promotion. It was beyond anything she had imagined. She had never expected such an opportunity, especially not after everything that had happened. But here it was. An acknowledgement of her growth, her dedication, and her ability to lead by example. I'm honored," Olivia Taylor managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for believing in me." Mrs. Eleanor Westwood smiled, a rare, genuine smile that spoke volumes. "You earned it, Olivia Taylor. Keep it up." As Mrs. Eleanor Westwood left the office, Olivia Taylor's heart soared. She had come so far from that first disastrous flight, and now she had the chance to lead, to be the person who could inspire the same kind of change in others that she had experienced. She had finally proven that people could grow, could change, could rise above their mistakes. And that, in the end, was the most powerful lesson of all. The road ahead was long, but Olivia Taylor knew she was on the right path, and this time there was no looking back. Her first day in her new leadership role arrived sooner than she had expected. When she walked onto the aircraft that morning, it felt different, like she had stepped into a new chapter of her life. The flight attendants she had once worked alongside now looked to her for guidance, and while it was humbling, it also filled her with a deep sense of pride. She had earned this position, and she was determined not to squander it. The flight was busy as usual, but Olivia Taylor handled it with a calm confidence that she hadn't had before. When a passenger had an issue with their seat assignment, she calmly and respectfully solved the problem, listening to their concerns and addressing them with empathy. When a crew member was struggling with a difficult situation, she offered her support and advice. Every interaction, no matter how small, felt like a chance to reinforce the values she had worked so hard to adopt: patience, humility, respect. By the end of the flight, as the plane touched down and the passengers began to disembark, Olivia Taylor stood in the galley watching her team work for the first time. She felt like she truly belonged, like she was part of something bigger than herself. She had gone from being the flight attendant who had once made a serious mistake to being the leader who could help guide others through their own challenges. As the crew finished up, Captain James Thornton approached her with a smile. "You did well today, Olivia Taylor," he said, his approval evident in his voice. "I've been watching you, and I can see how much you've grown. You're exactly where you need to be." Olivia Taylor smiled back, the gratitude in her eyes undeniable. "I couldn't have done it without you, Captain. You've always been there for me, showing me what it means to be a true leader." Captain James Thornton chuckled, shaking his head. "You've always had the potential, Olivia Taylor. I just helped you recognize it. You did the rest." As the crew gathered their things and prepared to leave, Olivia Taylor walked down the jet bridge toward the terminal. She paused for a moment, taking in the view of the plane behind her. It was the same plane she had boarded countless times, but today it felt different. Today, she wasn't just another flight attendant. Today, she was a leader. When Olivia Taylor arrived at the crew room later that day, she was greeted by the team she had worked with for so long. They congratulated her, offering kind words and a few playful jokes, but it was the look of respect in their eyes that meant the most to her. They knew where she had come from, and they knew the effort it had taken to get here. They understood that this was not just about the title, but about the journey. As she sat down to catch her breath, she glanced at the door and saw a familiar face: Mrs. Eleanor Westwood. She stood in the doorway watching the crew, her expression unreadable as always. But there was a glint of something more in her eyes. Approval, a sense of pride perhaps. "Good job today, Olivia Taylor," Mrs. Eleanor Westwood said as she stepped into the room. Olivia Taylor stood, surprised but humbled. "Thank you, ma'am. It means a lot." Mrs. Eleanor Westwood gave a small, knowing smile. "You've earned this, but remember, leadership isn't just about managing others. It's about inspiring them. Never forget that." Olivia Taylor nodded, understanding the weight of her words. Mrs. Eleanor Westwood had given her more than just a job. She had given her a responsibility, one that would challenge her every day, but one that she would embrace fully. "I won't forget," Olivia Taylor said quietly. "I promise." As Mrs. Eleanor Westwood turned to leave, she paused at the door and glanced back. Good leaders know when to follow as well as when to lead. Keep that in mind. With that, Mrs. Eleanor Westwood was gone, leaving Olivia Taylor alone with her thoughts. The truth of her words echoed in Olivia Taylor's mind. Leadership wasn't about authority. It was about earning trust, about showing people that you were willing to walk alongside them. As the crew room filled with laughter and conversation, Olivia Taylor took a moment to let everything settle in. The journey had been long, filled with mistakes, lessons, and growth. But now, standing on the other side, she felt ready for whatever came next. She had made it through the toughest parts, and now the real work began. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She was ready to lead because more than anything, she had learned the most important lesson of all. Leadership wasn't about having power over others. It was about having the power to change, to improve, and to make the world better. One decision, one action, and one person at a time. As Olivia Taylor walked out of the crew room and into the terminal, the weight of her journey finally felt like a distant memory. Her future was ahead of her, bright and full of possibility, and she knew that no matter what happened, she would continue moving forward with each step. She was becoming the leader she had always hoped to be. And this time, there was no looking back. The lesson learned from this story is the importance of respect, humility, and accountability in both our personal and professional lives. It shows that a thoughtless action or treating someone poorly can have serious consequences, not just for the individual, but for everyone involved. However, mistakes are not the end. They're opportunities to learn, grow, and improve ourselves. Olivia Taylor made a huge error by disrespecting a passenger, yet she turned that mistake into a chance for self-reflection and growth. Through facing the fallout of her actions, she discovered the value of taking responsibility, listening to feedback, and working hard to rebuild trust. This experience taught her that true leadership isn't about exerting authority or power. It's about guiding others, being compassionate, and continuously striving to do better. In the end, her journey shows that change is possible when you're willing to own your mistakes and learn from them. It reminds us that a positive work environment is built on mutual respect, teamwork, and the constant effort to improve every day. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more captivating and unforgettable stories. Stay tuned for more exciting content coming your way. See you in the next one.